As you're probably gathering, a lot of my ideas um, percolate for years and sometimes decades. Scholar was based on a dream I had in middle school. Shape of Water came from like elementary school. Um, and Zebulon Finch came from when I was in college, and I had this idea that never went anywhere about a zombie. This was before zombies were a thing, really. They this was the early '90s. I had this idea of this sort of zombie, and I thought, well, I can follow this one zombie through the ages because he won't die. But I just imagined sort of a expressionless zombie, um, and it wasn't a workable idea. But that idea of having someone who is dead who keeps going stayed with me, and eventually I cracked the idea that it was, he was dead, but he wasn't really a zombie in any kind of classical way. He was very educated and erudite, um, and it really, to this day, I feel like it's sort of my favorite thing I've done, and certainly the most ambitious thing I've done. And it was one of those things that I carried around with for years, and I figured it was, I was still working a full time job, and thought, well, this is going to have to wait until I'm retired or something because it's just too much. It's too much research. It's essentially like 10 books that each required massive research into 10 different decades. And there's just a lot to it. But eventually I figured, well, I'm not going to get any younger. And I should just go for it. So I just started working on it. And then once I sold it, um, just went into a 2-year period that I hope to never have again, where I just wrote day and night and weekends, and was working on it basically 24/7 for 2 years, and was buried in research. Like I literally had books to the ceiling, and all I did was Zebulon Fix. It was all I lived and breathed. Every decade presented its own revelations. I mean, I was never before Zebulon Finch much of a history buff, and it completely changed uh, me and the kind of books I like to read and movies I like to watch. It was like taking a self-taught college class. Like I just became conversant in American history. I had to. I think it's hard to pin down favorites. I learned a lot about World War I that I had never known. The golden age of Hollywood was fun to write about. In book two, there's a quite long section that takes place in World War II.
Yeah.
But after that, there's a section that takes place in the 50s. And of the whole two books, that was probably my favorite section to write. It was after all the dark stuff of World War II. It felt very light and optimistic to now suddenly be writing about the 50s, which of course was exactly how people living in the 50s felt, that the dark times were over, and of course they weren't. They just kind of shifted and gone underground. uh, but that was, to go from the grime and torturous details of World War II to suddenly to the bright kitchens and toasters and blenders of the 1950s was really an enjoyable contrast to play with. He speaks sort of in a kind of a Baroque 1800s fashion, and that's because when he was alive, he was, you know, vastly educated and just very intelligent. And so as the years roll on, he still maintains this style of speech. Uh, and that's something that comes relatively naturally to me, that kind of, uh, again, more Baroque writing style and dialogue. Um, I like those kind of books, one book that I read that was influential was Barry Lyndon, which has a protagonist that reminds me a lot of Zebulon in some ways, sort of a overeducated fop. Um, and it was the idea then over the course of these 1,500 pages is to watch him, sort of come down to earth slowly and slowly redeem himself over 100 years for all the bad things he did during his 17 or 18 years alive.